Alright, drawing four people, welcome to the tutorial on the 3 crayon technique. To save time, I've already constructed my armature. If you want to see this done, I have a tutorial that I did for 21A of the same pose. I believe the video is titled Complex Pose 3 in the 21A playlist. Okay, so I've got my basic shapes. I refined the head a little tiny bit, but the next step is to go in and put in my lines. This technique is pretty straightforward. There's a number of different ways of doing it. I'm showing you only one. Let's put in some stronger lines. I'm sorry, my son is in the back trying to get into the room. If you want to see how I'm building my lines, I have a tutorial called Rules of Line 1 and 2 where I explain my line work system. But at this stage, because I'm going to go into this quite a lot with lots of opaque layers, line perfection isn't really the priority. And I would say maybe because the technique is opaque, I'm going to go over this quite a lot, quite a few times, starting with slightly darker lines will ensure that your drawing's not going to get lost in the process. By the way, make sure you're extra careful because with this technique, particularly in the deeper stages of it, it becomes increasingly less correctable. So after a few hours of piling on all 3 of your colors, you're not going to be able to change stuff. It's going to be impossible. So don't rush in. Take your time. This is a slow technique. I'm going to have to break this demo down into a couple of parts and film this in segments in order to complete the tutorial. And then to save time, I'm going to render only part of this drawing. I'm not going to complete the whole thing. Okay, so let me just very quickly refine the head ever so slightly. Look, for the most part, when I'm putting in lines, I use my thumb and forefinger grip. When it comes to the head, because the details are so subtle, I usually prefer to switch to my writer's grip. There's some artists that are fortunate enough to have the skill, or I would say skilled enough, to have the ability to maintain the thumb and forefinger grip all the way through. I do not. I don't have that ability. I don't know. I feel like you get finer control over little features, small details with the writer's grip. Okay, so I've put in my lines. The next step is exactly the same as when we were doing our black and white rendering technique. You're going to find your light breaks. Where you see a body shadow, make sure that you use a fuzzy line to find the light break. So this particular image is using a slightly more diffuse light than what we have in our classrooms. The light breaks are going to be a little more subtle. But I can see that there is a body shadow running all the way over here, like this. We have a cast shadow over here, running this way, like this. This is very, very subtle because of the really strong reflected light, but we have a body shadow running like this, running across this way. We have a cast shadow running here that has a sharp edge, like this. In this image, there's a very strong secondary light bleeding out some of the dark values in the shadow. Not ideal. Not ideal. But look, I think these images from the New Masters Academy are just about the best resources online. They're not perfect. I guess I have some disagreements with the school about how the models should be lit. Alright, let's take a look at the light break here. Again, anytime you're seeing a body shadow, use a soft edge to indicate it. little body shadow here, like this. This entire part is in shadow, even though it's relatively light. Why? Because there's some kind of strong secondary light leaching out the values. For the head, I think it's pretty clear. We have a body shadow here and a cast shadow underneath the chin going this way. What else? Okay, I think that's it for now. Now, here's the next step. Use the side of your pencil. Make sure the pencil is sharpened properly, long like this, and put down a little bit of shadow everywhere you see body shadow or cast shadow. You're already starting off with a toned piece of paper. Don't go too dark. Okay, I forgot to indicate the light break here. And then this whole part is going to be ever so slightly in shadow. I'm breaking things down to simple steps. All I'm focusing on right now is separating the shadows from our lights and paying attention to what kind of shadow I'm looking at, either a body shadow or a cast shadow. Okay, her hair is slightly darker than the skin tone. If that's the case, shade the whole thing down one step. Okay, so we're going to use our blending stumps. I'm going to use my blending stump to blend absolutely everything that I see as shadow and make it a little bit smoother. This is ultimately a stylistic choice. Again, there's a number of different ways of using this technique. This is just one of them. At the end of the video, I'll show you some images of the various ways in which this technique is used. Or maybe I'll discuss it over Zoom, I don't know. We'll see how long this demo goes. Okay, the next step is going to feel a little bit counterintuitive. This is not a transparent technique in that, in a transparent technique, like the one we did last week, I'm utilizing the tone of the paper. In this type of drawing, the tone of the paper is going to disappear entirely. So, the next step is to take your white, and again, I understand this is counterintuitive, go over the entire drawing with your white chalk pencil. So the white chalk is going to mix with your black in the shadows, and in the lighter values, it's going to go bright. Pile it on. And by the way, when you're choosing your black, white, and red materials, I recommend staying with more or less the same brand, or at the very least, the same hardness of material. So all of my three materials are Conte. I've got my Conte red chalk, I've got my Pierre Noir, 2B, and then my white chalk, all Conte. They're all more or less the same consistency, the same degree of density. They're going to work well together. If the white chalk is significantly softer than the black, you're going to run into problems. So try to stay with the same material. So what's happening is that my white is mixing with my gray absolutely everywhere, and creating a midtone out of which I'm going to build my other values. Alright, so the next step is to take your blending stump and blend down this whole thing. I recommend using a clean blending stump, one that's dedicated for your lighter areas, for your whites. So don't make your lights too dirty. Let's go over the whites again, build them up a little bit. The initial impression is going to be a little bit rough. You really aren't going to get smooth results until you have a certain amount of pigment accumulated on the paper. You're not going to be able to move the pigments around effectively. So this is the initial first step. Now I'm going to go back in the shadows and start looking for slightly darker values. Look, I'm essentially doing a black and white drawing first, and then I'm going to colorize it. I'm going to add color to it with my red chalk. So let me work on this a little bit with the video off, and then when I come back and I'm done with this process, I'll show you guys how to add red. Okay? Okay, so I've built up the figure a little bit more in black and white. I'm still not quite done yet. Got a little bit more work to do before I start adding my reds. One thing to keep in mind is that whenever I add a layer of black in the shadows to go darker, so let's say I want to reinforce my core shadow here a little bit. Going this way, maybe the shadow here needs to go a little bit darker. Maybe I'm going to put in a core shadow here, a slightly darker cast shadow here. It looks like the cast shadow runs all the way across this way. What else? There is a shadow here, like this. Whenever I add black, I'm going to go over it again with a layer of white. Essentially, I'm using my white as a blending tool to soften my black values. Most importantly, what I'm trying to do is build up the amount of pigment on the paper, which will allow me to move it around. So right now, all the pigment is kind of stuck in the paper fibers, which is going to create a little bit of a streaky result. I'm trying to build up the amount of pigment on the paper right now. So I'm going to go a little bit more in the extremes of light and dark, get a fuller range of contrast. Give me a few more minutes, and then I'm going to start adding color to this thing. By the way, at this point I'm not going to be using the blending stuff because the blending stuff is very harsh and it's going to remove pigment as opposed to move it around. So avoid using the blending stuff at this point. Just let the pigments build up on their own. Okay, so I have my black and white more or less built up to the level I need in order to start working with my red chalk. The next step is actually relatively simple because I've dealt with the drawing in terms of value. And by the way, this technique is perfectly legitimate if I'm only working with black and white. So, last week we did a transparent technique where we're utilizing the tone of the paper. Here's an example of an opaque technique where the tone paper disappears entirely underneath a mix of both white and dark. Okay, next step, again, might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but I'm going to treat this red as if it's a transparent wash of color. So here's the next step. I'm going to colorize my drawing by throwing everything, both the shadows and lights, under a wash of red chalk. Now this model has yellow hair. There's no way for me to indicate yellow, obviously. I'm just going to show the distinction between the color of the skin tone and the color of the hair by leaving the hair completely black. So you can see by working thinly, I retain the value underneath, and my drawing goes from black and white to almost done, actually. Obviously we have a lot of work to do, but we have some kind of skin tone. Alright, so the next step is to blend this down a little bit. Don't use your blending stumps anymore. They're going to remove pigment. Use your fingers. That's a really gentle way of blending things down. And just really gently blend your color into the white. Because we have a lot of pigment there already, it's going to blend really well into the black and white value underneath. Okay, there's going to be areas in their skin tone which go a little bit lighter, which go a little bit redder. Now we can start going in and making distinctions. So, the red knocked down the value a little bit. Let's bring it back up. And now that we have a lot of pigment there, you'll find that the rendering is actually much more smooth. I don't need to use my blending stump. And I can make very gentle adjustments to the value now. let's say it's going a little bit lighter here, and then a little bit lighter in the kneecaps. I'm going to bring the values back to where they were when I hadn't applied the color yet. And I'm going to use this opportunity to start getting color variation in the skin tone. So for instance, I know the color in the extremities, the arms, the hands, the fingers, tend to go a little bit more red. So in those areas, I'm going to add a little bit more of my red chalk. In the kneecaps, for instance, sometimes they tend to go a little bit more red. The hands, obviously, once again. But also in the face, I notice that her cheeks have a little bit more red in them. You can start creating color distinctions. The other thing is the reflected lights in the shadows, if they're bouncing off skin tone, so light is hitting here and reflecting back in, are going to feel a little bit redder, a little bit warmer, like this. So look for the reflected lights. Think about where they're coming from. If they're bouncing off skin tone, there's going to be a degree of warmth there. So we've got almost everything we need in order for this drawing to look like it's in color. We have a warm skin tone that goes a little bit more gray towards the shadow. Our core shadow is the most neutral color. Our reflected light is slightly warmer. With these three materials, we get a pretty sophisticated, almost color-like effect. It gets us pretty close. And this is very, very good training for the next step when we start moving into full color. You can see the white becomes a very good blending tool. So whether you want to smooth this down completely or leave it slightly hatchy like I am, that's a stylistic choice. Let's see if we can get a few little subtle color variations in her nose. Her lips are obviously going, I just started the video, 1 second. Her lips are obviously a little more red. Let's do that. And you can also use your black. So if in the process your shadows have started losing contrast, you can always use your black to put them back. Now black plus red is going to mix a slightly brownish, grayish value, which is pretty close to the color you're seeing in the shadows. And at this stage I'm using my fingers to gently move the pigment around. There's enough pigment there that it's going to move very, very easily. It's going to feel slippery. Try to get a full range of contrast here, which is probably the last step, right, to get the very brightest values. I recommend blending up until this step, so the very last steps. Your brightest values, your highlights, your darkest darks, don't blend down. That last layer, if left unblended, is going to give your drawing a little bit more energy. Alright, I'm going to work on this a little bit more, then I'm going to take a photo, but I think this tutorial is finished.